Hi and welcome back to That Office Guy, and today we're going to take a look at probably one of the most important formulas that I use so often, and that is the address function. As we get into this video, guys, if you find it useful and informative, hit the like button. I really appreciate that. If you're new, make sure you do subscribe, and in doing so you'll be kept up to date with all the hints and tips that we have here for Microsoft Office. Right, with that said, let's jump down into the desktop and get into how to use the address function and why it is so very useful. Okay guys, so here we are on the desktop, and we obviously have Microsoft Excel. Now, this particular example, we're going to look at 5 different ways to use the address function. Each of them operate very differently, but obviously very useful. Now, for most people, you're probably going to want the A1 referencing rather than the R1, C1, but we'll get into the 2 differences anyway, and then we'll also talk about some of the use cases around this particular function. So we're going to start things off just by going up to A1 here, right? So this particular formula is the most basic address function, okay? So basically it returns an absolute reference, okay? And you'll see the result here is C2. So when we actually click into this, we can see in the address formula bar here, basically 2 parts, right? The first one is the number, the row number, right, the number row, and then obviously the column number. Okay, so these are the 2 variables that you're going to need in order to actually accurately pull together an address function. So in this particular example here, it looks at row 2 and the 3rd column, okay, which would of course be C2. Okay, that obviously is this area here. Now obviously you can get into just clicking on a specific cell, and that is also going to bring things back, and I'll get into that in a moment. But this one here is basically going to put the $ in front. It's basically absolute referenced, so it's completely locked in to what you've put in here. So in case of 2 and 3, it's absolute referenced to C2. Okay, so row number and column number, very straightforward. But obviously the address formula and the address function actually goes a little bit further than just this. You can actually use this formula to help with so many different tasks. So the next thing we want to look at here is an absolute row but a relative column. Okay, so in some cases you want to make sure you lock in, let's say, a header row, but you want to basically be able to change the columns as you drag a formula over to the right or to the left. So this is again another way of doing it, right? So in this address function, you again have 2, 3, 2. So row 2, column 3, and then we have if I click into here, and what we'll do is we'll click into the formula bar here. But basically this 3rd part to the formula is all about the ABS number there. Okay, so are you looking for absolute referencing, relative referencing, and so forth, right? And what I've got here is the references. So what we can see is 1 is omitted. It's always an absolute reference. Number 2 represents absolute row and relative comment. That is what we are using basically within this particular formula. 3 is relative row, absolute column, and then 4 is everything is relative, right? So when we actually come down into this formula, if it brings back $2, we know that we're using the number 2 as our reference, right? So when we come into here, we can see that we're using number 2, which is we want the row to be locked in, but we do not want the column to be locked in. Okay, so that's what the 2 represents. So row 2, column 3, and we're going with basically absolute row, relative column. Okay, and this obviously then allows you to move this formula to the left, to the right, down. It will always stay on row 2, but the columns will change as you move the formula. So pretty useful. Now the next formula that we want to obviously look at in terms of address is this one here. It's an absolute row, relative column, but it's in the R1C1 referencing style. So if you do a lot of VBA, Visual Basic, then ultimately actually the R1C1 reference style might be better for you. And also, if you're just used to using the R1C1 referencing, then ultimately this is how you would use it, right? So again, we're looking at row 2, column 3. We're looking for absolute row, relative column, but then we type comma and then followed by false. And what this allows us to do is basically use an A1 referencing or an R1C1 referencing, and you can basically go true or false here. It's false for R1C1 or true for A1 referencing. And for the most part, you're mainly going to want to basically type true here, and that will allow you to basically just see it as A1, C2, whatever, right? when you actually use the false scenario, it actually gives you this scenario here. It gives you the absolute row and the relative column. So R2, so row 2, column 3, and it's obviously in square brackets there to represent the fact that it is locked in, right? So it's actually relative column, sorry, whereas the row itself is locked down. So we know that row 2 is locked, whereas column in the square brackets is not. It's basically relative. We can continue to move it around. So again, another pretty much the same as this formula here, but it gives you in the R1C1 version. So again, if you're using something like Visual Basic, this is probably a little bit easier than this, but it depends on how you have your code set up. For the most part, though, you're probably not going to want to use the R1C1, but it's good to know that you can do this within the formula if you wanted to. Now the next one, this is actually basically using an absolute reference to another worksheet, right? So let's say you've got multiple sheets inside your workbook and you wanting to bring back a specific range. This is incredibly useful, specifically if you start thinking about using things like an indirect formula. But what this allows you to do is basically have the name of the sheet added to the reference. So again, we are using false as the A1 referencing style, so we know that it's actually an R1C1. So we have references, explanation point, R2C3. Okay, and this is because it's absolute referencing. It's completely locked in to row 2 and column 3. Okay, so R2C3 and its references is the particular sheet that we're going to. Now again, in here we can obviously change this false statement to a true statement, and it actually then goes ahead and actually adds it in as a C2, basically anchored in with the dollar signs. And this allows you then to use an indirect formula to target that exact address. Now we are obviously doing things in a really basic way to keep you guys, easy to understand how this works. But again, you can go much more complicated as your needs require it, right? And that's what I've did with this particular example. So obviously knowing that these are just examples of how to use the address function. And again, you can, of course, reference a external workbook and a worksheet as well. It doesn't have to just be a worksheet in this example, but this particular function then actually takes the address, and let's say we don't know what row number we want to bring back. We will want to use a match function to bring back the row number, and you could do the same thing for the column. If you don't know the column number, you can use a match function or a VLOOKUP or an XLOOKUP, something that basically brings back the number that you're looking for. Now the match function is exactly that, right? It will basically find the row number that the match finds, right? So if you're looking for Nick in the references sheet, it will find it within a certain range and it will bring back the row number. Likewise, if you go across the columns, the match function will also bring back a column number. So match is actually ideal when you start thinking about using it for addresses. Now, what I've got over here in the functions or references tab is basically a little lookup table. So I've got a little lookup table here with my name in it, okay? And if we come back to the example, this particular formula here is basically looking for an address, but we're going to match my name inside references F1 to F2 with an exact match being 0. Now, I will do a video on the match function. If you don't know how to use it, it is very, very useful for this exact purpose. So if we come back over here, we can see that F1 to F2 obviously contains the title of the little mini table and, of course, my name. So when we come back to our formula, we know that we're looking at F1 to F2. We're looking for Nick. It's going to bring back row 2, okay? And it's obviously going to bring it back within column 6. Okay, so I haven't done another match function, but you could quite easily put a match function in there as well to replace the number 6. But in this case, the number 6 represents column F. We can come back here. We can just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we know that column F is 6. Okay, so we're basically matching the row that has my name in it, which we know is row 2. We're bringing back the 6th column. Okay, and we're going for a number 4. Okay, so the number 4 represents relative. Okay, so we basically don't want to anchor it in. Okay, then we are basically going with a number 1 at the end here. And if I just come back into here, we can always check what is the style. Well, a 1 actually represents true. Okay, so if I actually type in false, for example, which would be a 0, I can actually go ahead and actually type that incorrectly. Let me just undo that for a second. If I actually type the word false, it then brings it back in an R1C1 style. If I actually replace the word false with 0, it's the same. And if I replace the 0 with true, it puts it back into basically an A1 style. And if you don't want to type the word true or false, you can use 0 or 1. So 1 is basically true, so I'll go ahead and enter 1 there, and we can see how we get the result, right? So F2 is then the function that we're bringing back. So really, really useful. And again, we could take this a little bit further. We could then add, of course, that it's in the references sheet. So again, in this formula here, I can then add an additional comma. In quotations, double quotations, that is, I will type references, close those quotations, press return, and now it's references. F2 is the cell reference for my name within the workbook. Okay, it's in a totally different sheet to this one. So this particular function is really useful, specifically if you want to be using it in an indirect way. So this allows you to basically break down and build very complex formulas, such as take apart from a lookup and that as a reference in terms of a column, look for a specific header, bring back maybe the sales for my name, find the sales reference for my name's location, and maybe I'm going to use that in some other way using the indirect address formula. This particular function is something I use actually quite regularly, and there are certain times when you do need to use this particular function to find out the address. And this particular function is absolutely fantastic. It really breaks it down and makes it very simple to get the address for what you're looking for. And specifically, if you're using something like Visual Basic for automation, this particular function makes your life so much easier. So guys, hopefully you have found this useful and informative. It is a pretty straightforward formula to use, and once you get your head around it, it makes your life so much easier. If you have found it useful, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe if you're new, and you'll be kept up to date with all the hints and tips that we have here from Microsoft Office. With that said, done and out of the way, I hope everyone has a fantastic day, and I'll catch you all in the next